A calm daytime discussion slowly shifts into a moment of unexpected tension on live television. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn? Not through shouting or theatrics, but through a firm disagreement that quietly shifts the mood of the room. That's exactly what unfolded during a recent daytime talk show appearance, when Chris Rock found himself responding strongly to a point raised by Sunny Hostin, creating one of those moments viewers could feel changing in real time. Make sure to subscribe to Prime Voice and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. The episode began like many others, with the hosts seated around the familiar table, moving from lighter headlines into a broader discussion about comedy, accountability, and public responsibility. Chris Rock was there to promote an upcoming project, and the tone at first was relaxed. He joked lightly with the panel, exchanged friendly remarks, and leaned into the kind of conversational rhythm daytime audiences expect. There was laughter, a few nods from the hosts, and the sense that this was going to be a standard promotional interview with thoughtful discussion mixed in. As the conversation progressed, Sunny Hostin steered the discussion toward the evolving role of comedians in public discourse. She framed her point carefully, referencing how comedians today are often expected to consider the social impact of their words more than in the past. Her tone wasn't accusatory, but it was serious, and the table noticeably quieted as she spoke. The audience listened closely, and the other hosts shifted slightly in their chairs, signaling a change from casual banter to something more reflective. Chris Rock listened without interrupting, his posture relaxed but attentive. He nodded occasionally, hands resting together, eyes focused on Sunny as she finished her thought. She suggested that with a large platform comes a responsibility to be mindful of how jokes land, especially when they touch on sensitive cultural or political issues. It was the kind of comment that often sparks polite agreement or gentle pushback on a show like this, and for a brief moment, it seemed like that's where things were headed. When Chris began to respond, his tone was calm, but there was a noticeable firmness beneath it. He acknowledged Sunny's point, saying he understood where she was coming from, and that he respected the idea of being thoughtful. But then he shifted, explaining that comedy, in his view, has always been about reflecting uncomfortable truths. He leaned forward slightly as he spoke, signaling engagement rather than defensiveness, and the studio audience grew quieter, sensing that this was more than a surface-level reply. He explained that comedians often serve as mirrors, holding up exaggerated versions of society, so people can recognize themselves and laugh, even when it's uncomfortable. His voice remained steady, but his words were deliberate. He emphasized that intent matters, and that while jokes can offend, they can also provoke important conversations. As he spoke, one of the hosts subtly raised her eyebrows, a visual cue that the discussion was entering more nuanced territory. Sunny listened closely, her expression neutral but focused. When Chris finished his point, there was a brief pause, the kind that feels longer on live television. She then responded, clarifying that her concern wasn't about silencing comedians, but about acknowledging how jokes can reinforce certain narratives, even unintentionally. Her voice was measured, but her phrasing was precise, and she gestured lightly with her hand to underscore her point. At this moment, the energy at the table shifted again. Chris responded more directly, still calm but clearly firm. He said that comedy can't exist if it's constantly filtered through fear of misinterpretation. He stressed that once comedians start second-guessing every possible reaction, the art form loses its edge and honesty. His body language changed slightly, shoulders squared, eyes steady, indicating that this was a principle he felt strongly about. The audience reaction was subtle but noticeable. A few murmurs could be heard, not loud enough to disrupt the show, but enough to signal engagement. Some people nodded along with Chris, while others seemed to lean in when Sunny prepared to respond again. The hosts exchanged quick glances, the kind that suggest awareness of live television pacing and the need to keep things respectful and moving forward. Sunny replied by reiterating that her perspective came from her background in law and advocacy, where words can have tangible consequences. She wasn't raising her voice, but her tone carried conviction. She explained that when influential figures speak, whether through jokes or commentary, those words can shape public attitudes. Her posture remained composed, hands folded briefly as she finished her thought. Chris responded once more, this time with a slight smile that softened his delivery without diminishing his stance. He said that comedy isn't policy, and that while it can influence culture, it shouldn't be held to the same standards as legal or political speech. He He pointed out that audiences are capable of distinguishing between satire and instruction. The smile faded as he finished, replaced by a serious expression that underscored how important this distinction was to him. One of the co-hosts stepped in briefly, acknowledging that both perspectives were valid and that the tension between free expression and responsibility is an ongoing conversation. This intervention helped ease the moment slightly, but the seriousness lingered. The pacing of the show slowed, and even the studio lights seemed to reflect the more thoughtful atmosphere. As the segment continued, the discussion widened, with other hosts adding their viewpoints, but the exchange between Chris and Sunny remained the focal point. Viewers could sense that while there was no hostility, there was a clear disagreement that hadn't been fully resolved. Chris leaned back again, returning to a more relaxed posture, but his expressions showed he was still engaged. Sunny nodded occasionally, signaling respect even as she maintained her stance. The audience responded with light applause at several points, not overwhelmingly, but enough to show appreciation for the respectful exchange. It was the kind of moment that daytime talk shows often aim for, but don't always achieve. A serious conversation handled calmly, without personal attacks or dramatic escalation. As the show approached a commercial break, the hosts transitioned the conversation smoothly, thanking Chris for his honesty and insight. The tension didn't disappear completely, but it settled into something more reflective. Viewers at home were left with the sense that they had witnessed a genuine exchange of ideas, not a rehearsed or sensational moment, but a real discussion unfolding live, with all the subtle shifts in tone and body language that come with it. This moment set the stage for continued conversation throughout the rest of the episode, and it was clear that the exchange between Chris Rock and Sunny Hostin would be one that audiences would remember, not because of raised voices or dramatic gestures, but because of the calm, firm way both sides stood their ground on live television. As the show returned from the commercial break, the atmosphere at the table felt slightly different, even though the smiles were back and the conversation resumed smoothly. Viewers who had been watching closely could sense that the earlier exchange still lingered beneath the surface. The hosts transitioned into a related topic, but the foundation had already been set, and everything that followed felt connected to that initial disagreement. One of the co-hosts picked up the thread by expanding the discussion beyond comedy and into the broader idea of public figures navigating modern audiences. The tone was conversational, but more deliberate than before. Chris Rock listened again, nodding occasionally, his expression thoughtful rather than animated. He wasn't interrupting or trying to steer the conversation back to himself, which made his earlier firmness feel even more intentional, not reactive. Sunny Hostin re-entered the discussion by referencing how talk shows like this one often become spaces where cultural expectations are negotiated in real time. She mentioned that daytime television reaches a wide and diverse audience, including people who may not always separate humor from endorsement. Her delivery was calm, but her words were precise, and she maintained steady eye contact with Chris as she spoke, signaling that her comments were still part of the same broader point she had raised earlier. Chris responded by acknowledging the unique platform of daytime television, agreeing that it reaches people from all walks of life. He said that he appreciated being able to have this kind of conversation in a setting that wasn't confrontational. But then he reiterated his core belief, that comedy loses its purpose if it's stripped of risk. His voice remained even, but his phrasing was clear and unapologetic. He leaned forward again slightly, a subtle physical cue that he was emphasizing something he genuinely believed. The studio audience reacted with light applause at the end of his sentence. It wasn't loud or overwhelming, but it was enough to register. Sunny took a brief pause before replying, her expression composed. She clarified that risk in comedy wasn't the issue for her, but rather awareness. She explained that awareness doesn't have to mean restriction, but reflection. Her hands moved gently as she spoke, reinforcing a tone of explanation rather than challenge. At this point, the pacing of the conversation slowed even further. One of the hosts interjected to keep the discussion balanced, noting that this kind of respectful disagreement is exactly what audiences tune in for. She smiled, and the table relaxed slightly. Chris smiled back briefly, acknowledging the comment, while Sunny nodded in agreement. Chris then shared a short anecdote from his career, describing how audiences have changed over the years. He spoke about performing the same joke decades apart and receiving completely different reactions. His tone was reflective, almost conversational, and it shifted the mood from debate to shared observation. The audience listened quietly, some nodding as he described the evolving landscape of comedy. Sunny responded by saying that those changes reflect broader societal growth, and that conversations like the one they were having are part of that evolution. She emphasized that disagreement doesn't have to mean division, especially when both sides are willing to listen. Her voice softened slightly, and she leaned back in her chair, signaling a shift away from direct rebuttal. Chris agreed with that point, saying that dialogue is essential, even when it's uncomfortable. He mentioned that being challenged on his views doesn't offend him, but it does make him think. This comment drew a noticeable reaction from the audience, including a brief round of applause. The hosts exchanged quick glances, recognizing that the moment had reached a more reflective tone. The conversation then broadened again, with other panelists sharing how they personally navigate expressing opinions in public spaces. While the focus wasn't solely on Chris and Sunny anymore, their earlier exchange continued to frame the discussion. Every comment seemed to circle back to the balance between honesty and responsibility. Chris listened attentively as one host described the pressure of speaking live, where there's no chance to revise or clarify in real time. He nodded, acknowledging the point, and added that live settings demand authenticity because there's no room for performance or polish. His delivery was calm, almost conversational, and it contrasted with the firmness he had shown earlier, reinforcing that his strong response wasn't about ego, but about principle. Sunny followed up by saying that live television also demands accountability, because words spoken in the moment can resonate far beyond the studio. Her tone remained measured, and there was no edge to her voice. The earlier tension had evolved into something more balanced, a genuine exchange of perspectives rather than a back-and-forth disagreement. As the segment continued, the hosts skillfully guided the discussion toward common ground. They highlighted moments of agreement between Chris and Sunny, pointing out that both valued conversation, awareness, and honesty, even if they approached those values differently. This framing helped settle the atmosphere further, and the studio audience responded with appreciative murmurs and occasional applause. Chris concluded one of his responses by saying that comedy, at its best, invites people into conversations they might otherwise avoid. He emphasized that laughter can open doors that lectures cannot. His tone was calm but confident, and he sat back in his chair as he finished, signaling that he had made his point. Sunny smiled slightly and agreed that humor can be a powerful tool when used thoughtfully. She added that discussions like this help audiences better understand the intentions behind words, even when they don't fully agree. Her posture was relaxed now, and the earlier intensity had clearly eased. As the hosts prepared to transition to the next topic, one of them thanked Chris for engaging so openly and respectfully. He responded with a brief nod and a smile, acknowledging the appreciation without making it about himself. The audience applauded again, this time more warmly, reflecting a sense of resolution rather than tension. For viewers at home, this part of the episode reinforced the feeling that they were watching a real conversation unfold, not a scripted exchange or a manufactured moment. The disagreement had been real, but so was the mutual respect. The pacing, the pauses, the subtle shifts in tone and body language all contributed to an authentic daytime television moment that felt grounded and relatable. As the cameras moved on and the discussion shifted, it was clear that the exchange between Chris Rock and Sunny Hostin had added depth to the episode, setting the tone for thoughtful conversation rather than spectacle, and leaving audiences engaged, reflective, and ready to continue watching. As the episode moved forward, the earlier discussion continued to shape the mood, even as the topic shifted slightly. The hosts introduced a new angle, connecting the conversation about comedy and responsibility to the broader idea of public reaction and accountability in the age of social media. The transition felt natural, not abrupt, and it allowed the dialogue to evolve rather than restart. Chris Rock remained attentive, his posture relaxed but engaged, while Sunny Hostin listened closely, hands folded lightly in front of her. One of the hosts pointed out how moments from live television often take on a life of their own once they're clipped and shared online. She mentioned that a single sentence can be isolated from a longer conversation, sometimes losing its original context. This observation drew nods around the table. Chris responded first, agreeing that context is often the first thing lost when conversations move to social media. His tone was steady, and he spoke slowly, as if choosing his words carefully. He said that comedians are particularly familiar with this, because jokes are often designed to build over time, not land as standalone statements. Sunny followed by adding that this reality is exactly why she emphasizes awareness. She explained that when conversations are reduced to short clips, audiences may not see the nuance or intent behind the words. Her voice was calm, but her point was firm. She wasn't contradicting Chris so much as expanding on the implications of what he had just said. The exchange felt less like a disagreement now and more like a layered discussion, each response building on the last. Chris acknowledged her point with a slight nod. He said that while he can't control how content is shared or interpreted, he believes in standing by what he says in full context. He explained that constantly adjusting speech to anticipate backlash can be exhausting and, in his view, counterproductive. His delivery was matter-of-fact, without defensiveness, and his body language remained open, hands occasionally moving to emphasize a thought. The studio audience reacted quietly, some nodding, others remaining still, clearly listening rather than responding emotionally. This wasn't a moment that called for laughter or applause, and the room seemed to understand that. The pacing of the conversation slowed again, allowing each idea to land without interruption. Sunny responded by saying that standing by one's words and reflecting on their impact don't have to be opposing ideas. She described them as parallel responsibilities, especially for people whose voices carry influence. Her tone softened slightly, and she leaned back in her chair, signaling that she wasn't pressing an argument, but offering perspective. The visual cues mattered here, and viewers could sense that the tension had transformed into mutual engagement. One of the co-hosts stepped in to summarize what had been said so far, framing it as a conversation about balance rather than conflict. She smiled lightly and remarked that these discussions are rarely about right or wrong, but about understanding different viewpoints. Chris smiled in response, and Sunny nodded, both appearing comfortable with that framing. Chris then shared another reflection, this time about audiences themselves. He said that viewers are often more perceptive than they're given credit for, and that many people can appreciate complexity, even when they don't fully agree. His tone was thoughtful, and he spoke more slowly, pausing briefly between sentences. This change in pacing gave his words added weight without making them sound rehearsed. Sunny agreed that audiences are capable of nuance, but added that media environments don't always encourage it. She referenced how fast-paced news cycles can pressure people into quick judgments. Her voice remained even, and her expression was calm. The conversation had clearly moved away from direct disagreement and into shared analysis, but the contrast in their perspectives was still present. The hosts allowed the moment to breathe, avoiding interruptions. This restraint made the exchange feel more authentic, as if viewers were watching a real conversation unfold rather than a tightly managed segment. Chris glanced briefly toward the audience before returning his attention to the table, a subtle acknowledgement of the people listening both in the studio and at home. Another host brought up how daytime talk shows often serve as a bridge between entertainment and serious discussion. She noted that viewers tune in expecting both, and that moments like this one demonstrate how those elements can coexist. Chris responded by saying that he appreciates spaces where disagreement doesn't automatically turn into confrontation. His voice was calm, and he smiled slightly as he spoke, signaling appreciation rather than relief. Sunny added that respectful disagreement models something important for audiences, especially in a polarized climate. She emphasized that listening is just as important as speaking. Her posture remained relaxed, and her delivery was measured, reinforcing the sense that the earlier firmness had evolved into mutual respect. The studio audience responded with light applause at this point, not directed at one person, but at the sentiment itself. The applause was brief and subdued, fitting the tone of the discussion. The hosts acknowledged it with smiles before guiding the conversation toward its next phase. Chris was asked directly how he navigates feedback from both supporters and critics. He answered honestly, saying that he listens, but doesn't let every opinion dictate his choices. He explained that growth comes from reflection, not from fear. His words were steady, and his expression serious, underscoring that this was something he had clearly thought about over time. Sunny responded by saying that growth also involves recognizing when conversations open new perspectives. She mentioned that even when she disagrees, she values moments that challenge her thinking. Her voice was calm, and she smiled slightly as she finished, signaling openness rather than opposition. As the segment continued, it became clear that what viewers were witnessing wasn't a clash, but a negotiation of ideas. The earlier strong response from Chris had set a boundary, and Sunny's measured replies had clarified her position. Neither appeared interested in winning the conversation, and that dynamic made the exchange feel genuine. The hosts began to steer the discussion toward wrapping up the segment, but the reflective tone remained. Chris leaned back again, hands resting comfortably, while Sunny mirrored the relaxed posture. The energy at the table had settled into something steady and composed. For viewers at home, this part of the episode reinforced the sense that the disagreement hadn't been about personalities, but about principles. The calm pacing, the careful phrasing, and the absence of raised voices all contributed to a moment that felt grounded and realistic. It was the kind of daytime television exchange that doesn't go viral for spectacle, but lingers because of its substance. As the conversation edged toward its conclusion, it was clear that both Chris Rock and Sunny Hostin had made their points without diminishing each other. The show had allowed space for disagreement, reflection, and connection, and the audience was left with the sense that they had witnessed something honest and unscripted. A real-time exchange that reflected the complexities of public conversation rather than simplifying them. As the show moved deeper into the hour, the conversation subtly shifted again, this time guided by the hosts toward how moments like the one viewers had just witnessed are perceived once the cameras move on. The transition was smooth but intentional, signaling that the earlier exchange between Chris Rock and Sunny Hostin wasn't being left behind. Instead, it was being placed into a broader context about live television and public conversation. One of the hosts mentioned that viewers often react strongly to moments of disagreement, even when those moments are calm and respectful. She noted that audiences sometimes expect clear winners and losers, but real conversations rarely work that way. Chris listened quietly, nodding once as she spoke. Sunny's expression remained attentive, her posture open, suggesting agreement with the observation. Chris was then asked how he personally feels when conversations like this are later discussed or debated online. He answered without hesitation, explaining that once a conversation is public, it belongs to the audience as much as it belongs to the people who had it. His tone was calm and reflective. He said he's learned to accept that people will interpret moments differently, depending on their own experiences and perspectives. As he spoke, he maintained steady eye contact with the host, his delivery measured and composed. Sunny responded by adding that this is especially true for daytime talk shows, where viewers often form emotional connections with the hosts and guests. She explained that those connections can intensify reactions, even when the exchange itself is balanced. Her voice was even, and she spoke slowly, reinforcing the thoughtful tone that had taken hold of the segment. The studio audience remained quiet, clearly listening rather than reacting. This silence felt intentional, almost respectful, as if the room recognized that this part of the conversation required attention rather than applause. The pacing of the show reflected that awareness, with fewer interruptions and longer pauses between responses. One of the co-hosts briefly reflected on how rare it is to see disagreement handled without escalation on live television. She acknowledged that tension often gets mistaken for conflict, when in reality, it can simply mean two people care deeply about their viewpoints. Chris smiled slightly at that comment, tilting his head in acknowledgement. Sunny nodded, her expression softening as she agreed. Chris then offered a perspective that brought the discussion back to his original response earlier in the show. He explained that when he speaks firmly, it's not about shutting down conversation, but about being clear. He said clarity matters, especially in environments where words can easily be misunderstood. His voice remained steady, but his emphasis made it clear that this distinction was important to him. Sunny responded by saying that clarity and compassion don't have to be separate. She explained that strong responses can coexist with thoughtful consideration, and that navigating that balance is something everyone on public platforms continues to learn. Her delivery was calm and deliberate, and her body language remained relaxed, signaling that her intent was understanding rather than opposition. The hosts allowed the moment to unfold without rushing it. There was no attempt to pivot quickly or inject humor to lighten the mood. Instead, they let the conversation stand on its own. This choice gave the exchange a sense of authenticity, reinforcing that what viewers were seeing was not manufactured drama, but a genuine discussion happening in real time. As the conversation continued, one host asked Chris how these kinds of discussions influence his work moving forward. He paused briefly before answering, a small but noticeable moment that suggested thoughtfulness. He said that conversations like this don't change his voice, but they do remind him of the range of people listening. His tone was reflective, and he spoke without defensiveness, making it clear that he saw value in the dialogue even when he didn't fully agree. Sunny followed by saying that dialogue itself can be the takeaway, even if no one changes their position completely. She emphasized that seeing respectful exchange modeled on television can have a meaningful impact on viewers. Her voice was calm, and she smiled slightly as she finished her thought, signaling appreciation for the space the show had created. The audience responded with a gentle round of applause, not loud or prolonged, but warm. It felt like acknowledgement rather than endorsement, recognition of the conversation rather than a particular viewpoint. The host smiled, clearly aware that the moment had resonated. As the segment began to wind down, the conversation shifted toward wrapping up Chris's appearance. One of the hosts thanked him for being open and honest, especially during a conversation that touched on broader cultural issues. Chris responded simply, saying he appreciated the opportunity to talk openly. His tone was relaxed, and his posture mirrored that ease. Sunny added that she valued the exchange and the chance to explore different perspectives in a respectful setting. Her voice was steady, and her expression genuine. The brief acknowledgement underscored that while they hadn't agreed on everything, there was mutual respect. The studio atmosphere at this point felt settled and composed. Any earlier tension had transformed into something quieter and more reflective. Viewers watching at home could sense that the conversation had reached a natural resting point, not because it had been resolved, but because it had been fully explored within the time allowed. As the hosts transitioned toward the next segment, they did so without abruptness, maintaining the thoughtful tone. The cameras pulled back slightly, capturing the table as a whole rather than focusing on any one person. This visual choice reinforced the collective nature of the discussion, rather than highlighting individual disagreement. For viewers, Part 4 of the episode served as a reminder that strong responses don't have to lead to division. Chris Rock's firm but calm stance, combined with Sunny Hostin's measured and reflective approach, demonstrated how disagreement can exist within respect. The pacing, the pauses, and the subtle body language all contributed to a moment that felt grounded and authentic. As the show moved on, it was clear that this exchange would be one of the most talked about parts of the episode, not because it was explosive, but because it was real. The conversation had unfolded the way many do in everyday life, slowly, thoughtfully, and without clear conclusions, leaving viewers with space to reflect on what they had heard rather than telling them what to think. As the episode moved toward its conclusion, the energy in the studio reflected a sense of closure rather than tension. The conversation with Chris Rock had reached its natural end, and the hosts transitioned smoothly into the final moments of the show. There was no lingering awkwardness at the table, just the calm familiarity that comes when a meaningful discussion has been allowed to play out fully. Before moving on completely, one of the hosts briefly revisited the earlier exchange, framing it as an example of how live television can create space for honest conversation. She thanked Chris again for engaging thoughtfully and without defensiveness. Chris responded with a polite smile and a short nod, his body language relaxed, signaling that he was comfortable with how the discussion had unfolded. Sunny Hostin added a final remark, emphasizing that conversations like this matter because they reflect the complexity of real-world dialogue. She spoke calmly, her tone warm, and acknowledged that disagreement doesn't have to undermine respect. Chris met her comment with a brief glance and a small smile, an understated but visible sign of mutual understanding. The studio audience responded with steady applause as the hosts formally wrapped up the segment. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was consistent, the kind of applause that suggests appreciation rather than excitement. The hosts thanked the audience, and the show moved forward without revisiting the disagreement directly, allowing it to stand on its own. Once the episode aired, viewers at home began reacting almost immediately. On social media, clips of the exchange circulated, not because of raised voices or sharp interruptions, but because of the firmness in Chris Rock's response and the measured way Sunny Hostin presented her perspective. Many viewers commented on how refreshing it was to see a disagreement handled calmly on daytime television. Some viewers expressed support for Chris, agreeing with his stance that comedy requires freedom to take risks. Others aligned more closely with Sunny's emphasis on awareness and impact. What stood out in the responses, however, was that much of the discussion remained thoughtful rather than combative. People quoted specific lines from the conversation, analyzing tone and intent rather than reacting emotionally. Several commentators pointed out the body language during the exchange, noting how neither Chris nor Sunny appeared hostile. Viewers mentioned the pauses, the lack of interruptions, and the way the hosts allowed the conversation to unfold naturally. These details contributed to the perception that the moment was authentic, not manufactured for attention. In the days following the broadcast, the hosts addressed the conversation briefly during subsequent episodes. They reiterated that the goal of the show is to create space for differing viewpoints, especially when those viewpoints are expressed respectfully. Sunny clarified that her comments were rooted in her professional background and concern for how messages are received, not in a desire to limit expression. Chris Rock's response to the continued discussion was minimal. In later interviews promoting his project, he referenced the appearance only in passing, saying that he appreciated the chance to have an open conversation. He did not escalate or reframe the exchange, which reinforced the impression that his on-air response had been intentional and complete. Media coverage of the moment reflected a similar tone. Rather than framing it as a clash or confrontation, most summaries described it as a firm but respectful disagreement. Headlines focused on the substance of the discussion rather than dramatizing it, and commentary pieces highlighted the rarity of seeing such a balanced exchange on live daytime television. For many viewers, the segment became an example of how disagreement can exist without hostility. It showed that strong responses don't require raised voices, and that differing perspectives can be expressed without personal attacks. The calm pacing and thoughtful delivery allowed audiences to form their own opinions rather than being pushed toward a particular conclusion. As the episode faded from immediate attention, the conversation it sparked continued quietly among viewers. People discussed it in comment sections and online forums, often referencing their own experiences with disagreement in professional or personal settings. The moment resonated not because it was dramatic, but because it felt familiar and real. By the end of the week, the exchange had settled into the larger pattern of daytime television moments that are remembered for their substance rather than spectacle. It didn't redefine the show, but it reinforced its role as a place where complex topics can be discussed openly. In the final moments of reflection, what stood out was not who won the conversation, but how it was handled. Chris Rock's strong response and Sunny Hostin's measured perspective coexisted without escalation, demonstrating that live television doesn't always have to trade authenticity for entertainment. Now it's your turn. Share your opinion on the conversation in the comments, and subscribe to Prime Voice for more narration-based talk show stories.